Hello and welcome to Ladies Talking Business. I am Moremi Akano. My guest today is an investor and an advocate for gender and inclusion in technology and entrepreneurship in Africa. She is the co-founder of PlusTvAfrica, a firm that believes in building Africa's first female-first venture capital fund, investing exclusively in technology ventures led by women and diverse founders. She is an expert in capital structuring and fundraising for companies with over 15 years of experience in finance roles across investment banking and private equity. She is a mentor at Endeavor Nigeria and former chair of the Finance and Capital Subcommittee of the Lagos State Empowerment Trust Fund's MSME Recovery Fund. Our guest is Eloho Omame. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Eloho.
Hi, Moremi.
If you know to ask, pick it so I don't, destroy the name.
I was watching you in fascination. Thanks.
Sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about female participation in technology.
Sure.
How can we encourage better performance of the female gender in technology? Because it seems like it's usually for the men.
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of maybe think about it slightly differently. So rather than performance, I would sort of think about inclusion and the inclusivity of women, right? Because the reality is that when you look at the performance of female-led technology ventures, women actually tend to perform a little bit better. Women tend to run their ventures with less capital. They tend to be better managers, etc. So the issue is really that still we have 98% of funding that goes into venture capital as a whole going towards teams that are not diverse and are not led by women. So it's less of a performance issue. I think that's a little bit of a myth.
Involvement issue.
And it's more of an inclusion and an equity issue.
Okay, so what can we do to get them included in these things?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. To my mind, I think first of all, it's important that we are actually, we're naming the problem and we're addressing it. Mm-hmm. I think often, for example, whenever I have this conversation, people will say, yes, but women are not starting technology ventures as often as men are. So it makes sense that 98% of the capital goes to men. Mm. Okay. But then you also know that when women do start their ventures, they raise capital. It's harder for them to raise capital than it is for, and there's lots of data about this, right? So I think we still play this, cat and mouse game where we're not really naming the issue. And I think in many ways that's important. Secondly, I think as a whole, the way that capital gets allocated globally, not just in Africa, a lot of people who are allocating capital are still men. The financial industry is dominated by men. Yeah. And again, there's lots of data that says that when you have a more diverse investment team, for example, female-led ventures tend to be funded more often, for example. And I'm sure that's the same if you're looking at credit at banks as well, right? So there is a leadership problem, there's a decision-making problem in terms of how capital is allocated. And I think the third piece is, and I would be a bit disingenuous if I didn't acknowledge it, is that I think the world of work is still a difficult world for a lot of women to navigate for many reasons. And we can approach it from technology and say, what do we need to do from a technology standpoint? So, for example, we'll look at jobs in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths, right? And how do we get more women there? But I think there's still a systematic structural problem around women's ability to participate fully in the world of work. And until we address that, again, very directly, and we think about the ways in which women actually live and the demands on their time and the multiple roles that we have to juggle and all of those things. Yeah. Until we do that, we're not going to see those big leaps. So I think it's those 3 or 4 things that need to change, personally.
Okay. All right. So I know you do a lot of things with startups. You try to help them. So what's the importance of startup support program?
I think they're really important for a couple of reasons. One is I believe that for a country like Nigeria, for example, I really view the startup ecosystem as one of the most exciting assets that we have for the future, right? We can build for a global, for the world, build for a global community. We can attract investment from outside, etc., through technology. Mm-hmm. And I think in order to nurture that, it's important that you then have support systems that work so that you're building an ecosystem that's growing, it's thriving, it's creating the jobs, it's inclusive, etc., right? So there's that. And I think that's at the systemic level. At the individual level, I also think that these support programs and what have you are important because they help us to drive better inclusion and better outcomes. So if you're a first-time founder, so you're doing it for the very first time, you might be technical, you might be non-technical, meaning you might be an engineer, you might not be an engineer. Either way, you're building a technology venture, for example. I think it's valuable to be able to say, how do I answer this question? How do I approach this?
I think it's even for every
industry. And it's true in every industry.
Yeah, because if you're doing something for the first time, you need help to navigate.
Yeah, so I think those are super important. And then also I think the third place that I think is important is if you then look at what I call underrepresented groups. So in this case, we're talking about women, but it could be anything. I was having a conversation last week about even people with disabilities and the fact that we don't really see them represented in the technology ecosystem either, right? So if you have these underrepresented groups, support programs that mean that they can participate more fully because they have the access and the pathways and the mentorship, etc., super important, right? So if we're serious again about inclusivity, all of these things, support
so I think the
is
keyword
critical.
Is serious. Serious.
I keep saying that. Maybe I should stop.
Okay. Sorry, I'm going to keep asking. Well, I'm going to ask this next question. It has to do with startups as well.
Okay.
Because I know you do a lot of things with startups. Very quickly, what's the best way, or what are the best ways for startups to raise funds that won't pinch them so much?
Yeah, I think I love that question. In some ways, I think because of the stage of our ecosystem, you still have these dynamics around pinching them, right? And what you find is as ecosystems mature, as more capital comes in, as there's more competition for funding startups, right? You find that when even the funders themselves have to be more competitive amongst themselves, it forces them to do things like, frankly, be better behaved and deliver more value to the startups, right? So you're right that there's still this issue of pinching sometimes because sometimes you find that you're having to give up so much equity in your business because you have very few options around how you raise capital. But with regards to what are the sources of funding, I always think about sources of funding as four types. I always think about what I call bootstrapping, which basically is your savings and your family and what have you. And we can talk about all the ways in which that is harder for certain people than others, but it's one. And you have founders who build businesses and they never raise, or they don't raise significant external equity anyway. Sometimes they raise debt. The other piece is equity. So when everyone talks about venture capital and what have you, the challenge with that is that you're effectively giving up ownership in your business, a certain amount. And some entrepreneurs just don't like to do that. They don't want to do it. The third is debt. You're not giving up equity, but of course you have an obligation that you must meet every month, every quarter, every week, whatever your debt arrangements are, right? And then the fourth, which I think is a real opportunity for us here in Nigeria, is what I think of as alternative financing. So one thing that I'm really researching at the moment is this idea, for example, and by alternative financing, I mean everything that doesn't fall into those categories. So for example, even things like receivables financing. So I have an invoice and you say to me, and I say to you, collect the invoice on my behalf, but give me 70% of its value today. That's one way you might fund. But there are other kinds. The one I particularly like is something called revenue-based financing, where you might say, give me $100, I'll pay you back $150, but you'll take it as a percentage of the revenue in my business over some time. And we don't do enough of that here.
I haven't even really heard of that before. But
I think it's really interesting.
After the break. We will go on a short break. Please stay with us. I'm still here with our guest, Eloho Omame. All right, Eloho, let's talk about why you're interested in female businesses and founders. For you, why is that focus on female businesses?
Honestly, the first most gut reaction or answer I have every time I'm asked that question is because I'm a woman.
Fair enough.
Right? And we all know that the world isn't fair to women, to many communities, but to women as well. And so for that reason, I think to myself, look, what's an impactful way that I can live in our society as a woman? Okay. And that's why. I suppose the secondary kind of derivative of that is the fact that you look at underrepresented communities in the world of finance. You look at the fact that 2% of capital goes to women. You look at the fact that 2% of venture capital goes to women-led ventures. You look at the fact that, I think there's something like a $60 billion funding gap for women versus men on the African continent. You look at things like, data around the biases that women face and the kinds of questions they get asked. And I just think it's really unfair because our society relies very heavily on the labor of women and on the productivity of women. Sometimes we don't pay for that, so we rely
very
on
heavily.
It.
I like how
very heavily.
Very heavily, yeah.
But we're not compensating women. We're not funding their ventures. We're not. So for me, I just think it's really unfair. And that's why I just spend all my time thinking about this stuff.
Thank you.
I guess.
For doing that for me. Okay, so you've been in the finance industry for about 15 years or over 15 years.
Yes.
In your own opinion, how would you say this industry can help support businesses, especially startups?
Yeah,
to like make life easier for them or running a business easier for them?
Absolutely. I think it's funny, I was watching a video earlier about how hard it is. It was a book retailer and he said anyone running a business in Nigeria knows how hard it is. And I thought, gosh, I wonder what it would take to change that story. I think some of the issues, of course, are outside of the capacity of private organizations. Okay. But even within private organizations, I think it's things like thinking about the ways in which we are serving the people, the business owners, and think about, is it effective, is it working? If you have issues where business owners are saying it is too hard to get loans from a bank or it's too hard to raise capital, I actually think the responsibility should be on the finance industry to say, okay, how do we revisit our entire sort of approach to these entrepreneurs? How do we do things like, for example, revisit our requirements for collateral? Mm-hmm. How do we make it easier for them to borrow either without collateral or to collateralize their loans? Mm-hmm. How do we look at alternative funds or alternative kinds of borrowing? If an entrepreneur says, it takes me 3 months to do an application for a loan, I actually think the responsibility should be on the bank to say, how do I make 3 months, 3 weeks, or 3 days? Mm-hmm. And with the advent of technology, there's so many opportunities to do that. And I think that's how we directly impact the product experience and
also
the customer
interest
experience.
rates, like maybe lower interest
well,
rates.
The interest rates to a certain extent are a little bit structural. It is an issue, but to a certain extent they're structural. I'm not saying that I think predatory interest rates are a problem. So when people just price out of what have you. On the other hand, you have an inflation rate of, I don't know, close to 15% at this point, right? So at the minimum, you know that you're going to have to pay a 15% interest rate because the bank needs to recover that. So there are some of the issues are economic and they're structural. I think to your point though about interest rates, I think there are a few models now where I just look at the interest rates. I think, yeah, but that you don't need to, you can more than cover your losses as a lender without charging, I don't know, 30% month on month.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And that's why most people don't go for loans.
Yes, there's all of that. Yeah. I agree.
Okay, so you work with a lot of businesses.
Yeah.
How would you advise businesses, especially startups and even businesses in general,
sure,
to do business diligently, especially in a place like Nigeria?
So I think operationally Nigeria is a really hard place. Each time I'm asked this question, or at least I tend to sort of approach it, first of all, even from the viability of businesses. I think for sure it's important that one is keeping the right records, for example, and one is compliant with taxes and all of these things. And it can be complex, it can be overwhelming, but I view that as a minimum cost of doing business. And you kind of have to say to yourself, and the cost could be time, not just money, right? But how do I cover that cost? How do I make sure that I have the right incorporation, I'm registered with the right tax authorities, all of those things, right? And that to me is important in terms of the diligence. The other piece though is, for me, is even in when people think about the kinds of businesses that they run, there are some businesses that sometimes I just look at them and when they say, oh, I'm really struggling, I'm like, yeah, I get that you would struggle because even if I look at the margin structure of what you're selling, I can't imagine you're able to get a lot of profit on top of that, right? So what we call gross margins. And those kinds of businesses for me in our environment are just really hard to get excited about. Unless for whatever reason you're getting some kind of concession or there's something about how you're doing business that means you're able, for example, to buy your inventory cheaper than the next person might be able to. So to me, there's diligence around the day-to-day running. There's also the rigor around the actual business that you're operating. I think sometimes there's a little inevitability when people say, oh, my business failed. I'm like, I get it because, for example, you're having to power your retail outlet with diesel and what have you 24 hours a day because of whatever it is that you're serving and the cost of that. Do you know what I mean? There's some businesses that you just say, unless you're really able to drive traffic into your store, for example, then it's fundamentally a hard business to run. And sometimes I don't think people have that level of diligence.
Would you be willing to give an example of
no.
such business?
I would not.
Okay. Forget I asked. Scratch that. I saw that comment. I said, would you be able to? But it's okay. Yes, I definitely understand the point you're trying to make about that. Great. Okay, so we'll take more of this conversation after the break.
Sure.
We will be back for more conversations after the break. Thanks for staying with us. Our guest is Eloho Omame, an advocate for gender inclusion in technology and entrepreneurship in Africa. So, Eloho, as a business mentor, what common mistakes do you see business owners make? And it kind of irks you, or you just wish they knew better?
Yeah. Less irks me and more my heart really goes out when I see this problem.
Okay.
Irks, I don't know about irks, but sometimes I just think, oh, I wish you hadn't done that. Usually it's when you have an entrepreneur that has taken outside equity and they have done it at a valuation, or they've sold too much, at a valuation that's too high, that's too low, or they sold too much of the equity in the business. And when I say too much, usually where you start to notice that it is too much is in two ways. Either the entrepreneur has given up so much equity in her business that she's just feeling really disincentivized to continue to grow it, because now it feels like I'm working for somebody else. Mm-hmm. But usually before that, what a good indication or a good marker of you sold too much equity is, I need to raise more equity now, and I know that the valuation that I'm going to get, that means that I'm going to dilute myself even more, and by the time I do that, I'm disengaged with, whatever I have left. And I think I see that a lot. I think it's unfair. I think we just need to be a little bit more responsible and entrepreneur-friendly sometimes as investors. So that one, my heart goes out. It's a difficult problem to solve.
Talking about that point, there's something that's usually said. I mean, it's not said in this exact way, but something like around, it's better for you to have
100% of
a piece of 100% than have 100% and have nothing. Something along that line. So what are your thoughts on that?
So I guess the idea is that and it's interesting, you're right, it gets said a lot in the context of growing a business, right, and taking outside equity. So the idea is, if you can grow something, if taking additional capital into the business allows you to take something that, I don't know, it was worth 100 to worth 1,000, but it means that you have less equity, your less stake in 1,000 is worth more. That's the idea. So I think you're right. It's a fine balance, right? And it's interesting. Recently, I was doing. I had a conversation on social media actually about this. Where is the line between how much equity I sell, how much I minimize this dilution, and the other alternative, right, which is maximum dilution and what have you. There are no perfect answers, which is why I empathize with entrepreneurs. It depends on the business. It depends on the conditions around which you're able to raise capital, all of those things. Mm-hmm. But I will say that I guess the strongest message I tend to leave entrepreneurs with is, if it doesn't feel right, if the terms feel unfair, if the investor feels like they're not a partner, etc., then I actually think it's okay to walk away and have 100% of your 100 versus 2% of your 1,000, if you see what I mean, right?
Makes sense. So what other common mistakes do you notice entrepreneurs make?
So one that really bothers me, and I'll say this from the perspective of startups and very early stage startups, is sometimes I'd like to see entrepreneurs talk a bit more to their customers before they start building technology. There's often this idea that I want to build an app, and that's great. But in some ways, the technology is a tool. The product in many ways could exist often without the technology. The technology makes it faster, better, cheaper in some way. But the question before that is, what's the core value proposition? I think Moremi wants X. Why don't I talk to 10 Moremis, 100 Moremis before I start building anything at all? But often what we see is, I know Moremi wants X.
So we're doing X.
So we're doing it, and we're going to spend $100,000 to build this thing. And then you build it, you put it out into the market, the demand isn't quite there the way you hoped, and then you start throwing even more money at it, right? Because you believe that the next thing is to do these big campaigns and to spend money to acquire customers. I think another kind of bugbear for me is around just sometimes, I'd love to see entrepreneurs sit on their hands a little bit and just, I know it can be, but just sit on your hands and talk to customers. So we call it customer validation. I think that's something I'd like to see a bit more of.
I think that's a very important point. Speak to your customers, know what your clients want.
Actually want. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, knowing what they want, again, in our industry, people talk a lot about pivots. So the idea that a startup is doing one thing and then But pivots, the best pivots come with, okay, so we think we're building this thing and we're talking to customers and okay, they seem to want it, then we're testing it, we're experimenting, and we realize that when people use our product, actually they're using it to do something else, or the real value that they were hoping to get is something else. Okay, let's pivot and let's do this because that's where the real market is. And that can only happen if you view your customers as, if you understand that you're solving their problem, right? So whichever direction they take you in is kind of where you want to go, as opposed to, I don't know, I want to build a payments app. And everyone is saying, well, I'm okay with payments apps I have. So I think that there's that kind of stuff.
Interesting. So what would you say is or are the benefits of networking to a business?
Oh, super important. But I must highlight the fact that sometimes networks are some of the traditional ways in which we think about networks and networking are actually some of the reasons why women struggle, for example, to raise capital, right? I'm just saying that because it's kind of my consciousness. So what I mean by that is venture capital as a whole, as an industry, tends to operate on the basis of what we call warm introductions, tends to. So this idea that I want to raise money from venture capital firm A, who do I know there? Who's the partner? Who has, who can introduce me to them? And that kind of, I guess, represents a trust before they start to talk to me. But because a lot of business networks tend to actually be very male-centric, you can imagine if somebody's looking for a warm introduction, it's harder for women sometimes to get into those networks that allow them to. So the whole kind of structure of how we think about things like that can be a little bit complex for different groups that are marginalized and underrepresented. But as a whole, I think networking is important. Networking is where you talk to your customers, when you talk to your potential partners.
Sorry, networking, talking to customers.
Yeah,
I would have thought it means talking to
people think it only means business partners and investors.
Okay.
It's where you talk to your investors, it's where you talk to your potential partners, it's where you talk to your customers.
Okay.
So I might sort of send you a message and say, hi, Moremi, I can see that you do television broadcasting. I'm building a new app that allows you to, perform your day-to-day role a lot easier and manage, for example, your schedule and your guests and things like that a lot better. Would you mind sort of taking a look at it? Can I come and see you for 30 minutes? That's networking. Or I meet you outside and I say, oh, gosh, I've been seeing you on TV. I'm building this great new app. This is what it does. What do you think? I've pulled you into my network. You're potentially a customer. You're feeding my customer my research as well. I can do that with an investor as well. I can have a similar conversation. I can have a similar conversation with a partner. They don't always have to be transactional. Networking doesn't always have to mean a transactional end, right? It's just about, in many ways, enlarging your social territory. And I do think it's important.
I agree. But I've learned a new one. Networking is not, doesn't always apply to transactions.
I think a lot of us think about it that way. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Eloho. So very quickly, before we go, what do you do to cool off from work or business?
Oh gosh, I have a few things. I do two things. I listen to a lot of podcasts, actually.
That's Steve Strainers.
Is it strenuous? I like it because I find that it just, I listen to a lot of podcasts. They're not always necessarily business podcasts. So often I'll listen to crime or I'll listen to, true crime, that kind of stuff. Sometimes I'll listen to sci-fi. So I'll listen to breakdowns about the last Avengers movie. Outside of that, I watch a lot of movies. I like superheroes, sci-fi.
You're really tech. Because I thought you said something like, I listen to music.
I don't really listen to music. I've never really listened to music. I'm trying now, but I'm not a big music person.
All right, Eloho, thank you so much for coming on the show. So we wish you the very best.
Nice to meet you. Thanks, Moremi.
This is how far we can go on today's episode. Do join us this same time next week for another episode. Don't forget to follow us on PlusTvAfrica Lifestyle on YouTube for more. I'm Moremi Akano. Goodbye.